Hello. I'm Sally, your host. Welcome to the third board, my master's chess channel. Here I will show you games from great players of the past, and other chess-related content. For today's video, my master chose an instructive game of the Cuban Grand Master, José Raul Capablanca, played in Hastings, UK, 1919. Capablanca became the third world champion in 1921. His opponent in today's game was Frederick Yates, an English master. Yates won the British Chess Championship 6 times, between 1913 and 1931. In his time, he defeated most of his illustrious adversaries, and one of his most famous victories was against Alexander Alekhine, at Carlsbad, in 1923, which won the Brilliancy Prize. Despite this, he did not have a good record in international tournaments, due to lack of consistency. So, let's begin. José Raul Capablanca had white and starts with pawn to e4. Frederick Yates responds with pawn to e5. And after, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5. We have on this board the Ruy Lopez, also called Spanish opening. The opening continues with pawn to a6, the Morphy defense, bishop to a4, knight to f6, castles, bishop to e7. And we have now the Ruy Lopez, Morphy defense, closed defense. After bishop to e7, main responses for white are bishop takes on c6, the delayed exchange variation deferred. Pawn to d4, the center attack. Queen to e2, the whorl attack. Pawn to d3, the modern line. And rook to e1, which leads to the main line, the martial attack and other variations. This was the move employed by Capablanca in the game. The opening stage continues with b5, bishop to b3, d6, c3, knight to a5. Instead of this move, it is more common for black to castle in this position. If black had castled here, the opening stage could have evolved through the Chicorine variation, which was at the time of this game, the de facto main line of the Ruy Lopez. After black castles, the Chicorine variation moves are h3, knight to a5, bishop to c2, c5, d4, and queen to c7. Let's return to the game. Yates decided not to castle right now, but we will see some moves of the Chicorine variation in this game. After knight to a5, Capablanca continues with bishop to c2, c5, pawn to d4, queen to c7, knight from b to d2, bishop to g4, Instead of bishop to g4 right now, Stockfish suggests for black. Castles. Bishop to d7. And c takes on d4. In these three lines suggested by the engine, black eventually plays c takes on d4, opening the queen's bishop file, and allowing the queen to put pressure on the c2 bishop. So, let's see only one variation. After c takes on d4, the game could have continued this way. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop to g4. h3. Bishop to h5. d5. Castles. Bishop to d3. Rook from f to c8. And the position would be equal. Let's return to the game. After bishop to g4, white continues with d5. Closing the center. g5. According to the wise fish, this move was a mistake. Apparently, Yates wants to start a pawn storm on the king side. Perhaps this was his reason for postponing castling. And because the queenside pawns are already advanced, he was possibly thinking of not castling at all. However, pawn to g5 debilitates the king side. In particular, the f5 square, an important one, cannot be defended anymore with a pawn if necessary. According to the engine, instead of pawn to g5, it was better for black to castle, consolidating black's king position. If he had chosen to castle, one possible variation would be b3. Rook from f to c8. h3. Bishop to d7. Knight to f1. c4. b4. Knight to b7. And the position would be slightly better for white. White would have partially closed the queen side, and could try to organize an attack on the king side, or continue on the queen side by advancing the queen's rook file pawn. Let's return to the original position. After pawn to d5, black could also have played pawn to c4, advancing on the queen side. One possible variation would be h3. Bishop to d7. Knight to b1. In order to defend the c3 pawn, after he plays pawn to b4. Castles. b4. Pawn takes on b3, by en passant. Pawn takes on b3. And white would be slightly better. Let's return to the game. After pawn to g5, white continues with knight to f1, threatening the g5 pawn with the c1 bishop. h6. Defending it. Knight to g3. In the closed Ruy Lopez, it is common for this knight or his companion to try to go to the f5 square. Black continues with rook to d8. Master Fish did not like this move. Instead of rook to d8, better options for black were rook to g8, knight to c4, and bishop to d7. but here I will show you only 2 variations. If black had played rook to g8, the game could have continued like this. b3, h5, bishop to d2, knight to h7, king to h1. But the position would be better for white, according to the engine. Let's return to the original position. Instead of rook to d8, if black had played knight to c4, one possible variation would be b3, knight to b6, c4, sacrificing a pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight takes on c4, h3, bishop to c8, queen to e2, knight to b6, bishop to d2. And although white would be a pawn down, his position would be better according to the engine. Let's return to the game. After rook to d8, the game continues with pawn to a4, b4. Instead of pawn to b4, it was better to play bishop to d7. The game could have continued like this. Pawn takes on b5, pawn takes on b5, h4, knight to c4. And white would still be better, but not so much as in the actual game. Let's return to the game. After pawn to b4, white continues with pawn takes on b4, pawn takes on b4, bishop to d3, threatening the queen's rook pawn, bishop to c8, defending it, bishop to e3, knight to g4, threatening to capture the e3 bishop. Observe how white's bishops are strong, especially when compared to the black ones. White continues with rook to c1, attacking the queen. This move, however, allows the capture of the e3 bishop. Stockfish suggests instead bishop to d2, and after that, the game could have continued like this. Queen to a7, rook to f1, supporting the f2 pawn, queen to b7, rook to c1, bishop to d7, h3, knight to f6, knight to h2, rook to c8, and white would be better. Let's return to the game. After rook to c1, black plays queen to b8. Instead of queen to b8, it was better to take the e3 bishop. The game could have continued like this. Rook takes queen, knight takes queen, rook takes knight, knight to b3, bishop to c4, knight to c5. And white would still be better, but his advantage would be smaller. Let's return to the game. After queen to b8, white plays bishop to d2, queen to b6, Queen to e2. Knight to b3. Rook to c6. Threatening the queen. You probably noticed how slowly Capablanca built his position. But his pieces are now invading the queenside, and Yates's pieces are forced in passive positions, especially his bishops. Black's own attack on the king side did not progress either, and his king side now has more holes than Swiss cheese. Nevertheless, Yates has now an opportunity to counterattack. Can you see Black's best move? This move would not equalize the game, and Black would still be in a worse position, but White's pressure would decrease. If you wish to study this position, pause the video now. According to the engine, the best move here is Queen takes on f2 check. One possible continuation would be Queen takes queen. Knight takes queen. King takes knight. g4. Bishop to c4. Knight to a5. Knight to g1. Knight takes rook. Pawn takes rook. And White would still be better, but not by as much as in the actual game. Let's return to the game. After rook to c6, Yates continues with Queen to a5. Bishop takes on a6. Bishop to d7. Threatening the rook. And here we arrived at another interesting position of the game. Yates not only threatens the c6 rook. If the rook moves, the a4 pawn will fall. It is interesting to note that Yates' move was very predictable. Maybe because he did not have many options. Instead of bishop to d7, he could have played, for example, bishop takes bishop. But that would lead to a worse continuation like rook takes on a6. Queen to c5. Knight to f5. Rook to g8. h3. Knight takes on d2. Knight takes knight. Knight to f6. Rook to c6. Queen to a7. Rook from e to c1. And the position would become dreadful for Black. Let's return to the original position. So, Capablanca probably thought with reasonable certainty about how to respond to bishop to d7, before he took the a6 pawn. Well, what would you do now if you had the white pieces? Did you like this game? I hope you enjoyed this video. Please support our channel by liking and subscribing. It will help us to make more content like this. I will continue to narrate this game in the next video. See you in part 2. Goodbye.